Welcome to the Manumission podcast, the show dedicated to unshackling ourselves from the status quo. Here's your host, H.H. Morris.
Greetings, friends. Happy New Year. Happy 2017. I know I uploaded an episode last week on New Year's Day, so none of you probably heard it, since you guys were probably nursing some hangovers. But nonetheless, it's the first real episode of the year, so I just wanted to say Happy New Year to everyone, and I hope everyone had a safe holiday season. I just got back from the Democratic People's Republic of California, where I spent some time with my family, and happy to be back in the free-ish state of Arizona. But today, I wanted to kind of give you my New Year resolutions for the show, so to speak, kind of what I look forward to, what I look to do with the show. And I know I alluded to some of these things, or outright stated a lot of these things in the introduction. But given that it's a new year, I wanted to kind of touch on some of these subjects again and expand on them, and hopefully get your feedback. So first of all, I wanted to address the issue of my point of view. And I wanted to make sure that everybody who listens to this show is very aware of where I'm coming from, because I want to be very transparent about, where I'm coming from, or the way that I analyze things, and not try to con anybody into trying to convince them to be like me, or that the whole point of this show is to turn it into an echo chamber where we're all in agreement and we're basically just spinning our wheels. That's really not the point. So I want to be very transparent about my point of view, and even exposing my biases. I mean, we all have biases. There's no way to get around it. We're humans. So whether it's our upbringing, our experiences, whatever, we're all going to have some biases, and that's okay. So there's not a problem with that. And in being as transparent with you guys, I hope that you guys appreciate that and realize that this is not some type of attempt to show that. This is not an attempt to try to, get some kind of cult following or anything. This is a discussion. This is an honest conversation of people who want to break out of the status quo, that want to get an alternative point of view, or at least an alternative type of analysis from what you usually get out there, whether it's in the media, even the people that whether it's your family, your friends, the people you work around. I mean, it's very rare to have this kind of conversation with people because everybody's basically indoctrinated into the status quo. So they just think inside of like what Tom Woods calls the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. And I think that's very real. So if we're trying to break out of that, this is the type of conversations that we need to have. So let me address my point of view real quick. And I did talk about it a little bit in the introductory podcast. So I've mentioned that I'm a libertarian, okay? And I talk a lot about libertarianism, but I don't want this to be a libertarian podcast per se, okay? I'll expand on that in a little bit. But again, let's get back to me being a libertarian. Well, I'm a libertarian, and what kind of libertarian am I? Well, at heart and at my core, I'm a libertarian anarchist, and however you want to define that, whether it's a anarcho-capitalist, a voluntarist, whatever it is, that's not even important at this point, or even for this show. But I do think that it is important for you guys to know to where I'm coming from, and why I analyze the topics that we discuss here the way that I do. And so just so that everybody understands what that means is that being a libertarian, and having come to the conclusion through my study, through basically rigorous introspection, rigorous study, and all that kind of stuff, I essentially came to the conclusion that, okay, if I'm a libertarian, I've always advocated for as small a state as possible, and basically even just a night watchman type state, or anything like that. I said, okay, why leave it at that? Why does it have to exist to begin with? All right. And so after I realized that I was not being honest with myself, I realized that well, it doesn't follow, because all of the things that libertarians complain about would essentially go back to being, go back to having the exact same problems, even with a minarchist state, a skeleton state, because then if you do have only the few apparatuses of a government being just the courts, the law enforcement, and the military, then those three things can be co-opted and can be essentially taken over, and you essentially go right back to where you started. So you just turn those three things, which seem pretty small when you talk about them, they turn huge. They get essentially corrupted. You're right back where you started, and so I realized, no, it's no longer. To me, it became very evident that the existence of the state is not a foregone conclusion. All right, so that's me. That's where I'm coming from. All right. Well, some of you might say, right, well, that's nonsense. I mean, how would be the common rebuttals to that is, how would we build the roads, or, show me an example of that ever happening again, or ever happening throughout history, or where that's ever worked, or any, those are the two biggest. Now, I don't want to make this about a anarcho-capitalism show or anything. I just want you to understand this, okay? I am not naive enough to think that this is something that's going to happen even in my lifetime. And this is just, again, intellectually, this is what I believe. This is what I believe is going to be the next social evolution for humans. All right? That's pretty much all it means to me. And that's why I don't want to make this show about anarcho-capitalism per se. There's plenty of those out there. There's more every day. And I think this show can be much more than that, right? So when someone says, hey, show me by the way, I'm not going to answer the roads question. If some of you ask for it, and if you guys send me some emails and say, hey, man, I'd be interested to know how you would answer that question or something like that, I might make an episode on that. I did in my previous show, and that's probably the most, the most common rebuttal to anarchism. But I don't want to get into it here. The one thing that I will say, to the one rebuttal that I'll kind of answer is, show me an example of where that's worked, or, why hasn't that been tried before, or whatever. Okay. So again, like I said, this is something that I think we're not ready for. And I think it's going to be the next societal evolution. What do I mean by that? Well, if I were to tell you, okay, let's pretend that we were back, in 10,000 BC. And you told me, or I came up to you and I said, hey man, this whole thing about chasing animals to hunt them, and having our women having to find, berries and seeds to pick them up, and picking up all our stuff, and having to build huts everywhere we go, and we're always on the move and all that stuff. And every season we have less and less game animals to hunt, and it's harder and harder to find food on the shrubs and the trees, and maybe there's a better way. I think we might be able to manipulate our environment to such a degree that we might be able to stay in one place. What do you think? And you told me, what are you kidding me? Like, show me an example where that's ever taken place. Who's ever done that? In the last 200,000 years, all our ancestors have lived like hunter-gatherers. I mean, come on, don't be silly, right? And then what happens? Just that, right? We get into, we're in the middle of the Neolithic Revolution. We have the beginning of the first civilizations, of the first settlements, towns, cities, the first governments, etc., right? And then, similarly, what if we had a similar conversation in South Carolina circa 1850, and I came up to you and said, hey, this whole thing about slavery, it just makes no sense to me. This is terrible. This institution just has to go. We need to just, release these people. We need to emancipate them and abolish slavery. And you said to me, hey, wait, listen. Hey, totally understand this. This is not, the best type of situation. And I totally agree, these people shouldn't be mistreated. And we need to make sure, that they're humans and they have human dignity. We need to not abuse them. We need to take care of them. We need to make sure that, they're well clothed and fed and, blah, 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 blah. But, getting rid of it, are you crazy? I mean, every civilization in history has had slavery and, it's the bedrock of our economy. Are you kidding me? Like, hey, I'll work with you to make sure that people, to ensure that people take good care of their slaves or whatnot. But you can't get rid of it. I mean, show me a civilization that hasn't had slaves. And lo and behold, it goes away. All right. So that is the way that I approach the stateless society question, which is, I know that is eventually what it's going to be, but it's not there yet. And like I mentioned before, it might never happen in our lifetimes. It's something that I know intellectually is the only logical step forward, and that is if we don't destroy ourselves first. So again, I wanted to make sure that everybody understands kind of where I'm coming from with that, and that'll hopefully help you kind of see some of my biases when I'm analyzing some of the topics that we discuss here. I also wanted to make sure, if people were to analyze my life, my personal life, you would probably classify me as a conservative. Not in politics, but conservative, just like I said, in my lifestyle. I'm, just a family guy. I do believe that the family structure is very important. Everything, all the stereotypes that you would probably have for a conservative, other than being religious, because I'm not. I'm an agnostic. You would peg me as. All right. So why am I not a conservative? Well, I'm not a conservative. The only thing that makes me not a conservative is that, or what makes me a libertarian over a conservative is that I don't believe in forcing others to live the way I do. Okay? So if you were the absolute, opposite of me, you had a complete different lifestyle for me, and you lived next door to me, which I'm sure people do, by the way. I drive around here, it might be Arizona, and it's a pretty, conservative red state. But even so, you drive around and I see, I'm for her stickers here and there, and I see people driving, Priuses and with their coexist stickers and, your typical lefty stuff that you see. And, are we out there shooting each other or, at each other's throats? No. It's when we try to use the apparatus of government against each other to force the other person to try to, to make people think the same way or act the same way, live the same life, that we get in trouble. So that's why I'm a libertarian over a conservative. And, that's not going to change. And my other approach that I'm going to make sure that I'm very clear about in this show is that I believe in having no idols. Now, there's a lot of people, and, whether they be, intellectuals or just personalities out there, whatever, that I really respect. There's some that I think have a lot of really good ideas and that have done a lot of good work, but I don't idolize anybody. And at the same time, there's also a few people that I actually just completely abhor. I might make fun of people. I might make light of some people's silly arguments or things like that. But the reason why I mention this is because in the previous podcast, I was very reluctant to name names. And I didn't want to. So if I was bringing up an argument or something that somebody said, I would just bring it up without bringing up the name or anything. And I was very reluctant because there's a lot of cult personalities out there. There's a lot of people who, I'll give you some examples. For instance, in the libertarian circles, there's a lot of people that are really, they're called Rand bots, right? So they're all about Ayn Rand. And there's, I've read some of her stuff. I've studied some of the objectivist philosophy and all that kind of stuff. And, there's good stuff in there. And you can't deny her influence on the libertarian philosophy and libertarian movement. There's a lot of people that, for instance, Stefan Molyneux also, and prior to him making this very hard right turn during the presidential election, even before that, a lot of people were just absolute Stefan Molyneux haters, and obviously there are probably even more now inside the libertarian camp. He's obviously picked up a ton of followers from the conservative camp throughout the election. But my point of discussing this is that I think it's important that we get the best out of everything. All right. So whether it's something that Ayn Rand said, or Stefan Molyneux, or Jeffrey Tucker, who took as hard a left turn as Stefan Molyneux took the right turn, in recent years, we can get the most out of everybody, and we can just take the good stuff. We can criticize the stuff that we disagree with, and we can try to, break it down and analyze it and point out why it doesn't work. But just because you disagree with someone, 80% of the time, even half the time, whatever it might be, we shouldn't just completely dismiss them outright, because we might be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. All right. So I'm not going to be reluctant in naming names and, either pointing fingers or whatever it is. I want to be a little more punchy in my approach and a little bit more controversial and confrontational on this show. And I hope you appreciate that. I think it'll make it more fun. It'll make it more interesting for sure. And I just mentioned it, controversial topics. I'm going to address a lot of things that are taboo, especially in the current climate. All right, the political correctness stuff, it just does not sit well with me, and I want to be able to talk about a lot of things that, especially nowadays in school, in schools, in colleges, universities, not just in the United States, but in Europe and a lot of places where intellectuals are, and where social justice warriors and political correctness reign. You can't touch a lot of topics. So whether we're dealing with things like immigration, open borders, abortion, you name it, I want to talk about it. I want to have an honest discussion, not be afraid to touch some of these things, because that's the only way that we're going to get anywhere in terms of possible solutions, approaches, arguments, whatever it is. All right. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on in this segment is about the format. So I'm going to try to be doing this at least once a week, but I decided that if I want to do any follow-up episodes as necessary, I might just do that. All right. So in a couple of days from today, something comes up, or I have some epiphany and I actually have the time to sit and do it, I'm just going to do it. All right. I'm not going to try to sit and have this hard and fast schedule, because first of all, my schedule, my regular work schedule doesn't allow it, but I also don't want to, have things get stale and have you guys also have to sit for 7 days to wait to get more content. And I think it'll just be better if I just try to do it a little bit more organically and just put stuff out there as it comes to me and as things happen in the world. And the length is also going to be fluid here. I mean, if it's going to be a half an hour, if it's going to be an hour, sometimes, whatever, I just don't know. I'm not very good at trying to control these things. If I'm just talking like I'm talking right now, I mean, it could go on for forever, and then sometimes my brain and my mouth just do not connect, and I can't get anything out. So, we'll see. But the other thing is that I want to evolve this show based on your feedback. All right, so I really want to make sure that I listen to you, and a lot of people are very reluctant to reach out, especially on social media. They'll do get a lot of private messages and people that don't want to either comment on things that I might put out there. By the way, I don't do Facebook that much anymore. I've really grown quite tired of Facebook. So if you want to see me where I'm a little bit more interactive these days, it's probably on Twitter. I mean, I that's another New Year resolution for me, is to try to be a little bit more engaged in social media. It's tough for me, guys, because I'm working all the time and I'm in front of other stuff, and it's hard. I try to go in there as often as I can to look at what's going on and comment. More than anything, I just like stuff and read stuff, and that's how I get a lot of my news, since I don't have cable television and I don't watch cable news. So be aware of that. So that's pretty much what I had in terms of the status of the show, the state of the show, if you will. And so today, what I wanted to talk about is the political spectrum. And no, it is not a typo how I wrote the title, the Spectre-um. And the reason it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, because I really do think that there's a big problem with the dualist binary way that we look at the political spectrum, the left versus right, liberal versus conservative. But nonetheless, that's what we got. I mean, that's what 99% of people out there, that's how they see things. So it doesn't matter where you are. I don't care if you're here in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's usually broken up between left and right in your country. And by the way, if you live in a country where that's not the case, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what it's like in your neck of the woods, because I'd be really interested to see. I know that in my native country of Mexico, for instance, there are a ton of parties, and that's also a hallmark of a lot of third world countries and some banana republics and some weird places around the world where it actually isn't just two parties. They have like 20 of them. In Mexico, they have a ton. They've consolidated quite a few of them over the last few years, but I mean, they used to have just like ridiculous amounts. And you know what my thoughts behind that, right? I mean, I addressed that in one of the episodes about the myth of representative government. Are you really more free? Is it actually better if you have more options when the person that wins with the plurality of the vote, with 20% of the vote? I mean, come on. But I digress. So the left versus the right, liberal versus conservative. Here is the problem right off the bat. When we're talking about liberal versus conservative, we run into a huge issue in the fact that what is liberal yesterday is conservative today, right? I mean, if you just start analyzing it from the point of view that you have people that at some point came up with something that might have been radical or revolutionary, and now, 200 years later, do we consider that radical or revolutionary? No, it's actually now considered conservative, right? So because of just that, the nature of things, it's very, very difficult to grasp exactly, what belongs where, right? In what bucket do we, because we as humans, we want to be able to explain the world, even if it's not to other people, even if it's just to ourselves. I want to be able to compartmentalize this. I want to be able to say, okay, I understand this, and this belongs in this box, and this belongs in that box. So it's very easy for us to say, okay, well, it's either left and right, it's either liberal or conservative. And again, something that I always found very interesting when I'd read or see people debating is the issue of, where the founding fathers of the United States, liberals or conservatives, right? And I think this highlights that issue very, very well, because some make the argument, and both make very good arguments, by the way. But, some will say, like, for instance, liberals would say, well, they were liberals. I mean, they were revolutionaries. These people were going to start something new, and they were fighting against the status quo. And by default, they were liberals. They would be, leftists, if you will. Or, and there's a lot of truth to that, and that's those are some good points. But then at the same time, especially if you study the history more in detail, you'd say, well, no, you can't say that they were liberals, because they were actually conservative in that what they were trying to do is go back to something, right? They were trying to fight for the recognition of their rights as free Englishmen that go all the way back to the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution less than 100 years prior. So, or almost 100 years prior. So, you have pretty good arguments on both sides. And again, that highlights the point that I was making, that what is liberal today is conservative tomorrow, right? So, all right. I think I got that backwards the first time. But you understand what I mean. The other thing that is very common and that splits things in this binary form is, and that usually also, by the way, I don't know if you can hear that. That's my my whiskey that I'm having while I'm chatting with you. That's good stuff. The way that it breaks out in this binary form is also city versus country. And that's, I think, since the beginning of civilization, that's kind of been the perennial struggle and a source of friction between people, in that city life is markedly different from country life. And so an urban setting is going to present a different set of challenges, and it's going to lead to a different lifestyle than those in the country. And so those two are always at odds. And if you think about it in many ways and in many places, when you break things down between liberal and conservative, you're also talking about the city being more liberal and the country being more conservative. Now, it's not a one-to-one relationship. It doesn't work perfectly, but for the most part, that's the case, and it's for that reason, right? Because people are exposed to a lot more things and have different types of lifestyles in an urban setting than in the country. So, and I wanted to go through the development of the American left and right conservative liberal thing real quick in broad strokes, just so that you guys can see the problem here. And I hope by the time I'm done with this, you guys can see just how challenging this is. And I'd like to see, what can we make of it? All right. So, I mean, if you go back, you have to go back to the British system and before even America, right? And even right when they split, because they kind of, went different paths in terms of what left and right mean, right? So the Tories and the Whigs, for instance, it was basically that was your right and left, your liberal and conservative. The Tories were the conservatives, the Whigs were the liberals. Eventually, it became the Tories, again the conservatives, versus Labor, which is what you have now. And that's because the classical liberals, the liberals of the 17th, 18th century, all the way up to the early 20th century, those liberals went away. They essentially went away in Britain. But something happened differently in the U.S., which is the classical liberals were actually absorbed by the Republican Party. So you had the Democrats versus the Whigs, and the Whigs eventually pretty much became the Republicans. So it became Democrats versus Republicans, which were the liberal versus the conservative party. And the liberals in the U.S. actually kind of were absorbed by the Republicans. So whereas the classical liberals essentially, like I said, went away in Britain, that was not the case in the U.S. And that's also one of the reasons why you see that in the U.K., liberal actually means what we mean by libertarian, really, in the U.S. And so it's different, right? And if you're listening to me in other parts of the world, that's probably the case as well. It's only in the United States, and when we say liberal, we're talking about a leftist or progressive, but I'll get to that. Then there was the rise of progressivism in the 20th century in the United States, and essentially progressives came about, and their ideology was that the state, so government, is an instrument, or can be and should be used as an instrument of social change. All right. And now there were progressives in both parties, but for the most part, progressives were Democrats. I mean, you can find several examples of Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt and stuff, but for the most part, it was the progressives were the Democrats. And again, that's when you started seeing the creation of the big nation state, the big more centralization, the government reaching out and trying to do more things as an instrument of social change. And ironically enough, because this is counterintuitive to what we think of today, conservatives, early in the 20th century, they were the elites. They were the elite writers, the elite journalists. These were the folks that were as the old right, the H.L. Menckens and such. And these were the elites and the elitists. And these were the folks that were, against modernity and against all this industrialization. They wanted to go back to a more simple life where people actually, enjoyed the simple things in life and weren't all about, all of these new things that were coming up with so much growth in the country and all these new machines and all these new things, new ways of doing things and new fads and all this kind of stuff that industrialization was creating. And, there were non-interventionists, and again, these were the conservatives. So again, if we think of conservative these days, you don't think of, anybody anti-war or non-interventionist, but that's what it was, the old right and in the early 20th century. And it is at this time during the progressive era that it was the Democrats, the Democratic Party, that became the receptacle of socialism and communism. And that makes sense, right? Because if you're going to think that it's the state that should be used as a tool to enact social change and to kind of tinker with society, then obviously, a socialist or a communist is going to, they're going to be amenable to that, right? And that kind of continued up in many ways up until this day. That's why the progressives are still inside the Democrat Party. Now, then after World War II, you have kind of what some people refer to as the New Right. And this was kind of focused on tradition and culture. And it was more of instead of looking at things or conservatism as a kind of political ideology, it was more of a way of life, and something that you can see in folks like Russell Kirk. And again, it was still non-interventionist, and but it was kind of like this resurgence of, hey, we need to kind of get back to basics and focus on what's important in our lives. And but there were still this was still the free market ideology, if you will, but still very, very different from what we would consider conservative today. In a lot of ways, obviously, not all. And then after the New Left, and this was kind of more in the 60s, starting in the 60s, then you have the neoconservative. Oh, but before I got to the neocons, then you have also the New Left, right? So this is, again, they were already progressives, but the New Left this was when you started to get in the times of the hippies and all this the civil rights movements and equality and the welfare state, and that's when the left actually finally became what we consider them today, or at least what they consider themselves, which is to be anti-war. And that was during, like, for instance, the Vietnam War. But I mean, think about it. If you think back on Democrats, since the Civil War, which was, that was a Republican that prosecuted that war, and Abraham Lincoln. When we're talking about World War I, Woodrow Wilson ran his campaign basically saying, hey, no, I'm not going to get involved in that European war. And what did he do? As soon as he got in, boom, right? He was in there, a Democrat. FDR, World War II. Who was the first American president to send troops into Southeast Asia and Vietnam and all that stuff? JFK, right? Well, we also have Eisenhower in the Korean conflict. So again, we're talking about two guys, right? and then who was in there for the whole, pretty much the whole Vietnam War, LBJ, who brought it to a halt, Republican Nixon, right? So, we need to study history to see these patterns and to see exactly what what actually took place. Because if we just look at it through a straw, or according to the way that things are today, we miss a lot. Okay, so that was the New Left. Then we now have the neocons coming up in roughly the 60s, 70s, and these were ex-communists. Okay, these were ex-communists that embraced big government, and they had a hawkish foreign policy. Now, the reason why these neocons came to be is because the New Left, and after the New Left came about and they started all of their different programs and all of their social tinkering, a lot of the people on the left started getting disillusioned, and they saw, they saw some social decay happening in the 60s. They saw the result of some of these big government policies. They saw of the beginning of the welfare state. Keep in mind that after the Great Society, poverty didn't go down. I mean, things kind of stabilized for a couple of years, and then after that, it's kind of started going back up, and you're seeing all this, all these expenses going towards this stuff, and you see that nothing's getting better. You have the rise of the Black Panthers. You have, I believe it was 1968 that had the highest murder rate ever it was like the peak of crime and murder rate in the United States. And so a lot of people became disillusioned. That's also not a surprise that's why Nixon came into power. The Democrats lost control. But yeah, so they became disillusioned, and they kind of turned to the right, these neocons. But they still had their kind of big government ideas with them. They didn't let go of the whole welfare state thing. They said, well, we need to have some sort of, a net, a social safety net of some sort. Maybe we just need to tinker with it, but we don't need to get rid of it altogether. All right. So, that's a big government thing. And that up until then, it had been something anathema for conservatives. Now, the other side of or another characteristic of the neocons was that they were very hawkish, foreign policy. And again, up until then, for the most part, conservatives were non-interventionists. And, there's a lot of different reasons. A lot of people have explained it in different ways. But the way that I like to put it is, during that time, the United States experienced a lot of things that kind of freaked out the neocons. And they said, well, first of all, we had some, pretty big losses with Barry Goldwater. There were, we kind of had to leave. We don't want to go back to the whole, everything that we experienced through the Vietnam War. There was the 1973 war in Israel and all these things. So they said, you know what? The U.S. is an instrument for bringing democracy and bringing change to the rest of the world. And so they embraced that. And they said, we need to be involved everywhere that we can to ensure that we bring this ideal that is the United States to other people around the world. All right. And then, you had this kind of resurgence of the religious right in the 80s after the 60s and the 70s, when you had the free love movement and the hippies and let your freak flag fly and all that kind of stuff, that you kind of saw this kind of backlash of a religious folk in the 80s, and you had this religious right. And that's kind of been waning for the last couple of decades. But there's still an important and sizable portion of conservatives. So up until recent times, basically what we had is on the left, on the right, you had pretty much the Republicans that were essentially neocons for the most part. The people in power and the people that kind of ran things in the Republican Party were essentially the neocons that I just described before, all the way up until or going back as far as the 60s and 70s, and then in the left, what happens? You still have these progressives that were in there, and yeah, there had been some changes and some people that changed their ideology somewhat, but for the most part, it was still progressive, and we're still looking at progressives, and nowadays they describe themselves as democratic socialists, and you can just go listen to Bernie and Elizabeth Warren to see what they mean by that. Essentially, it's socialism via the ballot box as opposed to socialism the communist way through armed revolution and by seizing all the means of production. Essentially, what they mean is, okay, fine, we'll let you have your silly capitalism, you capitalist pig, but once you make your money, we're going to take half of it so we can spread it around, right? That's essentially what democratic socialism means. So the neocons of today, are up until recently, well, still today, I guess, they were still hawkish on foreign policy. They claim to be for fiscal prudence, but again, they're kind of talking about out of both sides of their mouth when they're still okay with a welfare state to some degree and things like that, with more intrusion in the markets and things of that nature. They have been pretty open to immigration. If you remember, a lot of the debates between even within the Republican Party, how many of them, most if not all, it was all of them other than Trump, that were like, yeah, we're for immigration. We need to let people in, and we'll give them a way to stay in here and to eventually gain citizenship and all that stuff. And before that, it was something that was just not, it was unheard of. And they're not particularly religious, but they throw a lot of bones to their religious constituency. Now, a lot of you might think, well, that's weird because, Hollywood, celebrities, all the leftists out there, they're always pointing out to how backward these Christian conservative Republicans are. But not as much. I mean, if you really think about it, they will pay lip service to the religious right quite a bit. They will, but in terms of actual policy, not so much. I mean, George Bush in his days, probably the one thing that the big religious bone that he threw out there was he wanted to pass a constitutional amendment to make marriage between a man and a woman. That went nowhere. But again, it was just a bone. And they'll throw those things out there because they know those people exist and that they are part of the base. But for the most part, it's not about religion. Now, the liberals, they claim to be the anti-war faction. The Democrats pretend that they're anti-war, that they're the wealth redistribution, party of wealth redistribution through, again, a large welfare state. They're also social justice warriors, which is kind of just an extension of the welfare state, right? It's through the welfare state that you are able to give out the goodies that you need for the people that you claim are either needy or underrepresented or whatnot. And they're also with that also comes a lot of political correctness. Is we need to tell you, we can tell you what is okay to say, what's not okay to say, and they deride everything about traditional America. And to them, traditional America is white, heterosexual, male, and all that kind of stuff, right? So they deride all that because to them, that's exactly what led to all of the ills that they see in the world today. And obviously, that makes them, for open borders, because to them, that's pretty much how they're going to get more of people that agree with them. All right. So then you have this big shakeup with this recent election, with the Trump election through the campaign. And now we have another change, right? So how I just showed you and going through it in the last couple of centuries, how you kind of went back and forth, and at some times one was interventionist at one time, another one was for war, anti-war, blah blah blah. Now you're back to non-interventionist. At least that's what Trump says, right? He wants to get out of all these places. He says, we need to get out of the Middle East. We don't need all these wars. He's the one saying, hey, we don't need to make war with Russia. We don't need to antagonize them. But then he's also now not for the free market and more about protectionist economics, but very vocal against political correctness and completely anti-immigration. Whereas, like I said before, the neocons were open to it, albeit, they had some hoops that they'd make people jump over, but they were just nominal, really, if you actually analyzed what they proposed. But then now, I don't even know what to call the new left, the new left, the neo-left, I don't know, because now they've also switched, and now the left here in the United States, now they're the ones with the hawkish foreign policy, right? So now if you listen to them, they're the ones saying, hey, what Russia did was an act of war. They meddled in the election. They can't get away with it. Now, if you're saying that Russia committed an act of war and that you need to do something about it, that means war, right? That means attacking them. That means actually fighting. Now, I never bought into the anti-war thing, and I haven't bought into the anti-war thing from the left for the last 8 years, because obviously we know that, through the 8 years of Barack Obama, the United States is still in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is now also in Syria and Libya, and has been, bombing Yemen through their proxy Saudi Arabia and all this stuff. So I think they've been full of it for a very long time. But at least through the in a lot of these cases, the left they could always deflect, because they could say, oh, those are just Bush's wars, and Obama had nothing to do with them. He's just trying to get out of there, or he's just trying to do the best he can with what Bush left him. But sorry, guys, you had 8 years. There was no reason for Obama to do what he did, and Hillary Clinton, by the way, to do what they did in Syria. There was absolutely no need, no reason to do what they did in Libya. Absolutely no need to do what they did and what they're doing in Somalia and in Yemen. All right, so they own that, and you don't see them protesting out in the streets for peace and all that kind of stuff. So they've been, and again, if now they're calling for war with Russia, then I'm sorry, that's it. That has zero to do with George Bush. So they've been exposed as far as I'm concerned. So again, this kind of flip of agendas and platforms. And, ironically also, they're now very critical of Trump's protectionist policies in the economy, when all the things that he says he wants to do is because he wants to bring more jobs for the common folk, for the average American, for the working American, which is what the left claims to be for, right? They claim to be, hey, it's the middle class that has been battered this whole time. Again, after 8 years of Obama, that didn't change. So, okay. But if you're saying that it's the middle class that we need to help, all of the protectionist policies that Trump is putting forward are the ones that he says are saying, hey, this is what's going to bring back the jobs for middle America. But again, now the left is against those. So now that they're having all these companies that are saying, yeah, we're going to come back to the United States. Yes, we're going to invest money in the U.S. again, and they're against that. So now they're against the middle class. So I don't know. So again, let's go back to the whole concept of why is it that easy, okay, for people to change their agendas and their platforms so easily, to go back and forth, where a party or a political ideology can flip back and forth between being for war or anti-war, or for small government, big government, all that kind of stuff. It's like, how is that even possible? I mean, when we think about the political spectrum, right, we see it as this horizontal line, and we have on the left, you have the the big extreme, let's call it communism. And then on the far right, you have, fascism. You have Hitler versus Stalin, this big, long line, horizontal line. That's the spectrum, right? That's how we think of the world. That's how we've been taught to think about the world. But if you look at both extremes, you look at both, the Stalin side and the Hitler side, and you look at them, they look pretty darn close. They look pretty similar. They both resulted in scores of millions of people being killed, both internally and through war. It was totalitarian regimes, all that kind of stuff, right? So how do we make sense of all this? Okay. The way I like to look at it is it's actually not a horizontal line. It's actually a vertical line. And it's a very thin line. And you have the left side of that line and you have the right side of that line. So when you look at it vertically, it kind of starts making sense. They're right next to each other. So if you were to straddle that line, you can jump back and forth between both sides of that line very easily. It's just a quick hop over. And you don't even have to go all the way over. You can just, pilfer some ideas from one side and bring to the other, because you're actually right there at the same level. All right? You're not far away. Like when you look at it through a horizontal line, you're like, well, there's no way these things could be that far apart when a lot of these things look just the same. Okay? And that is statism. Statism is just the belief in the necessity of the state to begin with. And all of those things are basically two sides of the same coin. All right? And all of it is socialist, if you actually think about it. Because in order to have, if you're on the right and you say that you are a supporter of the military or of law enforcement, all that stuff, you need a large state for that. You need to redistribute wealth to create that. It's no different that if you're on the left and you say, I want to, tax people in order to give welfare to the poor, right? Again, two sides of the same coin. So when we start looking at it that way, things start making more sense. So I hope that makes more sense to you as well. And we'll talk more about that on this show in a lot more detail. So let me leave you with this. Now knowing what we know now and what I just discussed and the way things stand today, I just wanted to give a few predictions for 2017. A few positive ones, maybe a few not necessarily negative ones, maybe skeptical. I don't know. I'll leave that up to you. First one is, I think that Trump's wall is going to be his Gitmo. What I mean by that? Well, remember how Obama was running on, hey, close Gitmo, we're going to close Gitmo down and all that stuff. He was paying lip service to the far left on that. And again, he's out in, let me see, what is it, 10 days, 11 days? It looks like 11, 12 days, whatever it is. He's going to be out and that place is still open. I think the wall is going to be something similar for Trump. So we'll see if that really happens. But I think when they actually realize how much that's going to cost, and even I think it was either yesterday or today, it came out that he was going to ask Congress to pay for it. And it's like, oh, don't worry, I'm going to ask for Mexico to reimburse us. So he's already kind of backpedaling on that. But I think it's not going to happen. And it was something that he was just being, it was all bluster. But we'll see. I think that's my prediction. You guys can keep tabs on this and see what I get right and what I get wrong. But the other is that the protectionist policies that he's that he's putting forth, I think will backfire. And the reason is this kind of goes with my other prediction, which is that the current bubble will either burst or it'll keep inflating. He acknowledged that we're living in a bubble right now in terms of the economy. And nothing that he's doing or that he's done or that is happening right now has done anything to turn that around. And I haven't seen any of his policies that he's put forth, at least, that are going to undo that, to at least let some air out of that bubble without actually popping it. But again, we'll see. Now, on a more positive note, I think that the détente with Russia if it actually does happen, that actually cools off, which I think it will once he comes into power, could finally put an end to the Syrian conflict. And if that happens, that's actually going to go a lot further to ease the issue with the immigration problems around the world and in the U.S. in terms of the problems in the Middle East immigrants. But we'll see. I hope that that's the case. Now, the other positive thing that I think will happen is that the mainstream media is going to continue to lose credibility and clout. He keeps trolling them on social media. They don't know how to control him. They don't know how to get to him. He's always getting to them. And I think that that's going to keep going. And I don't know about you, but I relish that. I love to see that. As silly as some of the things are that he might say, or as crass or unprecedented, which I don't really give a crap about that. I think that's going to keep going, and that's been a ton of fun for me to watch. I don't know about you, and the other prediction is that the left is going to continue to adopt libertarian policies to cut ties with Trump. Ironically, what I mean by that is that they're going to keep with things like efforts like the Cal exit and things like people not paying their taxes because they don't want to support Trump's policies. And a lot of the things that traditionally libertarians have always called for, which is, hey, we don't agree. We don't care if it's Bush. We don't care if it's Obama. We don't care if it's Trump. We don't want to be part of a system that uses coercion to, do whatever it is that they want to do, whatever it is that politicians want to do. And ironically, I think it's going to be the left that's going to be calling for all the stuff that we libertarians have been calling for a long time, and albeit for the wrong reasons. So don't get me wrong. I by no means am under the illusion that leftists are going to be now libertarians because they're going to be employing these tactics. No, they're doing them all for the wrong reasons. And if they, and if California left the Union, it wouldn't be a libertarian paradise. They would turn it into the Soviet Union if they could. All right. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. So we'll see. Those are kind of like my predictions, at least for for this year. Some things to watch out for. So keep me accountable. If I get any of them wrong, let me know. I'm also going to be, I don't care when I'm right or wrong about things. I'll be upfront with you guys. Those are just kind of my analyses of the way that I see things going, but we'll see. But again, I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about some controversial stuff. I wasn't kidding. Next episode, stay tuned for it. Watch out for it. I'm going to be discussing a very hot topic of immigration, and I hope you stay tuned. See you then. If you want to know how you can help me keep the show going, or if you have a question, comment, or recommendation, you can contact me directly or through social media. Find out how to do all that by visiting manumission.com.